Before we start today's episode, I have some exciting news. From April 7th to 11th, 2025, I will be hosting a free online virtual summit called No More Heroes. This is a gathering of men's work leaders from across North America, and we're going to be diving into myth, initiation, fatherhood, archetype, and the masculine psyche as a whole. Furthermore, we'll be looking at where we are in terms of men's work today and where we ought to be going to bring forward a brighter world. If this is interesting to you, good news. It's free and open to everybody. You can find a link to reserve your seat in the description below. Now on to the show. The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Soma Miller. Soma Miller is a father, men's coach, psychedelic guide, and body worker at the forefront of a new paradigm of emotionally mature, integrated masculinity. As the founder of The Essential Man, he helps men cultivate deep intimacy, embodied leadership, and to live purpose-driven lives. Drawing from somatic and relational practices, his work guides men through transformation in their relationships, their sexuality, and their self-mastery so that they can lead with clarity, integrity, and heart. He and I speak to the current state of men's work and masculinity in our modern era and what we see as a meaningful path forward for men the world over. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Fantastic. Well, Soma, thank you so much for being here. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today.
I am as well. Yeah.
Beautiful. The listeners would have had a bit of an introduction to you through the bio at the beginning of the episode, but we haven't had a great amount of time to dive into your story as to what brought you into men's work and what brought the essential man into being. So if you would, I would love to know how this came about, how it happened.
Sure. Yeah. So many years ago, probably my early 20s, I was probably like 23, 24. I was a bit of a vagabond, traveling around a bit, just exploring life at that age, before van life was like a cool hashtag thing. I was doing van life. Yeah, I think I came across a presentation at some kind of an event about a man speaking about his experience through what I believe was the Mankind Project and like a rites of passage that he had gone through. And something about it really spoke to me on a deep level. How he held it, how he presented it, and simultaneously, I was also I was reading a book by somebody by the name of Malidoma Soma, and he's was like a indigenous African, raised in like a traditional village, but sort of brought up sort of between two worlds, was taken away at a young age by missionaries and adapted to Western thought, Western culture, and then escaped and went back and had like a traditional rites of passage at 18, which was much later than they would normally do it in his culture. And yeah, I mean, I think those two things coincided at the same time in my life. And this book also talked about just the way in his culture that they would use ritual to just invoke certain forces beyond, what we're taught are available to us in our, muggle kind of world. That's a Harry Potter reference. Anybody? Um, anyway, so yeah, right around that time, I was like, I was just feeling called to have that experience. Like, I started to come into this internal question of like, what does it mean to be a man? And so I actually created a ritual for myself. I was, like I said, I was like living in my van, traveling around. I had migrated south from where I had originally heard that lecture, and I was down in, I think it was Joshua Tree on a full moon, and I went out on this big boulder in the middle of the night and kind of created this ritual for myself. Like, I built a fire and created kind of a threshold for myself to walk through. It wasn't so much I was trying to initiate myself. It was more like I was calling in like that experience for myself somehow. Right. And then it was probably just about like a week or maybe a few days later that I landed in a small town that I'd never heard of. Somebody just like recommended it when I don't know, stopped somewhere along my way. And I was in this town called Ojai, California, Southern California, and saw a flyer on a bulletin board, and it was like this, another kind of presentation of a group of men that had gone through rites of passage, and they were doing, talk for the community just to hear about their experience. And I went and checked it out, and I was also in a relationship at the time that was, had kind of gone off for quite a while, but I was still hanging on a bit out of my own sort of desperation and just lack of having the courage to really listen to myself and my heart. And yeah, I went to this thing, and they, it was just very serendipitous on some level. And, I just knew I had to be a part of the next iteration of that work, which was, being offered, like they were sort of opening up their circle to welcome in like a new group to go through that. And that particular branch of, men's work and rites of passage was led by a teacher, a therapist by the name of Francis Weller. And yeah, I feel really blessed and privileged to have like encountered that at that stage of my life. And I was definitely the youngest person there. Most of the dudes, it was kind of like before it was cool and hip to like do men's work, right? So most of the guys were in their 40s, 50s. And my first sense was like, who the fuck are these guys? Like, I don't really relate, but I was still like into it, wanted to be there. And yeah, so that opened up a period, really for the next 15 years of exploration with that particular group of men. Like, I did we went through this rites of passage experience for about a year. And, I stayed in that small group of men for about, 13, 14 years, something like that. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of just the start, right? I mean, it's a long journey of my, foray into men's work and all the different pieces that have come together. That's kind of where it began. But I've always been drawn towards self-actualization from a pretty young age. Early 20s, I got into practicing yoga and reading all kinds of books on spirituality and self-development. And um, yeah, I think from there, I did a number of different permutations of men's work. I did some work that was, somewhat inspired by more like Ken Wilber style, uh, integral thinking and relating through an organization called, at the time they were called the Authentic Man Program. So a lot of their work was around relationships, and I think also somewhat inspired by David Data-esque work, but a little different. And and from there I studied with a teacher by the name of John Wineland for a few years, and that was about the point at which where I started to consider that maybe I can offer this to the world in some way. I was I had a pretty well established business already that in many ways was purposeful and aligned with my values, but I was being called to something different, something deeper, and so I think I sat on it for at least a couple of years before I was really ready to almost like take on a whole new identity, which is what it felt like to me. Um, and yeah, I think it was probably about 8 years ago that I launched my business, and yeah, I just felt called to serve men and to create, a culture of masculinity where there was a deep sense of belonging, where it invited men to get into their bodies and really turn on all of their capacities that are, were potentially dormant. And so my work since then has been kind of synthesizing different aspects of the things that I've learned and cultivated over the last 16, 17, 18 years, 20 years. I can't, I'm sorry, I'm losing track. I guess it was like over 20 years ago. So it's been a long time. And, yeah, so I'm just, putting those pieces together and really supporting men to step into who they really are, underneath all the conditioning around masculinity, around their environment that they grew up in. There's a lot to unpack, and those things are often intertwined. And yeah, and even like as I've seen men's work kind of come online in the last few years or so and become, like I said, like it seems like a little trendy. Um, I'm really trying to stay in front of what's happening to make sure it's held in a certain, a certain level of integrity, because I think there's a lot of stuff that I see that's also just becoming like these kind of tropes of, that are really under nuanced in the approach. And I, in some cases, when it's brought in that way, in this like social media bite kind of culture, I think it's often misunderstood and sometimes can cause more harm than the good that it can do. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that overview, Soma.
Yeah.
There's some really powerful pieces in there that I think stand out for me and will be meaningful blocks for us to step forward on into this dialogue. What I noticed is that the role of ritual and initiation was key, particularly in the book that you mentioned. There was a sort of synchronous drawing in, and almost, you didn't use the word, but I might use the word from my own perspective, a mystique around it, where it's like, okay, what is this? What does it actually mean? And what was he missing out on? Why did he have to go back? And then the role of tribe, when you were able to drop into a brotherhood or fraternity that was all geared towards a similar goal, holding a container with similar values. And then also the role of mentorship. I think all three of these are absolute essentials when we're looking at the world of men's work just in general, but also as we look at it back into antiquity. And as you're speaking to having the desire to stay ahead of men's work trajectories and trends and tropes as they're playing out in social media, that to me, there's an interesting intersection there insofar as there are very real and very necessary aspects of the journey to developing into an integral man that cannot be reduced to a soundbite, cannot be reduced into a 30-minute webinar, can't be reduced into a slogan, that in fact there is a deep and I want to say dire, just given our current circumstances socially, need for strong pillars within this men's work community, if we want to call it this globally. And so, based on this, I'm curious. We're talking about tropes. This might be a fair way to dive into this topic. What are you noticing insofar as it pertains to the collective of men's work, be it on social media? What are we seeing taking place right now that's catching your eye?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of good that's going on. I just want to start with that, and also acknowledging that I'm only seeing the surface level of a lot of it, right? And so it's easy to just, reduce it myself through my own perception of what's being presented. With that being said, I guess the concerns that I have is, I think one of the deep conditionings around men that requires a lot of undoing is this kind of performative version of masculinity where it's like it hooks into an archetypal aspect of that core masculine, which is here to kind of perform and to be of service, right? This is why it's kind of tricky and dangerous, right? But what I mean by performative is like we're doing masculinity rather than like being who we are, right? Allowing that authentic transmission of our own masculinity to just move through us. It's like we're doing somebody else's version of it, and it's supposed to look a certain way. It becomes kind of prescriptive. And, even with like some really amazing work, like archetypal work around like, king, warrior, magician, lover, right? Like we mentalize it and it becomes this like a concept versus like a real experiential truth that somebody embodies through years and years of practice, right? And so the danger I see is that coupled with like, oh, I did a weekend workshop and now I'm like I'm a king. So that's one piece. And I'm not saying everybody's taking it that way, but it can be taken that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with that comes other hooks around the masculine psyche that tie into like tools that are useful, right? That help us to maybe build more capacities or something, like, go like all the guys like getting into cold plunges and thinking, that's deep men's work, right? Because you can sit in cold water and I've done that, and there's value in it, right? But it doesn't help you to be an emotionally mature man. And I think that's often what's missing are the more nuanced relational tools, the deeper understanding of our own psyche, and a lot of the work that I do, and maybe I'm jumping ahead a bit too much here, but it's it's learning how to like reparent ourselves, right? Because I think
Mm.
what's different between modern culture and traditional rites of passage, and I'm not an anthropologist, so I could be totally off here, but what I see is, or what I make up, the story I make up is that the traditional cultures had much more intact um, experiences for raising children that allowed a certain developmental process to occur around like healthy attachment and belonging, right? And and with that, moving into adult man stage, came a little more naturally, right? It doesn't mean there
Mm-hmm.
wasn't some challenge and they had to like, face some really dark shit, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's, I guess I feel like there's missing pieces and I haven't quite figured out what they are yet. I'm trying to piece those together. But they had that intact attachment experience, the sense of community, village, right? That sense of belonging. And they also had a cultural heritage, right? That had a kind of meaning making spirituality that provided like a tapestry for why they do what they do. And I think what's also missing, and this is a cultural thing in general, is we're trying to fit, what it means to be a man into a distorted systemic cultural, whatever is going on right now. Like we live in this extractive, commodified idea of culture. And so, you know, I think I see a lot of people teaching masculinity that's based on that kind of premise. And I think there's something missing in that mindset and narrative, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Working back from what you said, it's almost as though when we find ourselves ensconced in a system that is missing meaningful pieces as it relates to the development of not just men, but all humans into actualization, then the mold that we are given that we try to fit or to fill is going to necessarily be lacking in a non trivial way. And I think that that's a really key piece. We might attribute the over mentalization that you spoke to earlier as a result of that. Because, in large part, in my opinion, our society is highly mentalized. It is not so much connected to the body, not our own bodies, not other people's bodies, not the body of the earth. And so there is this fragmentation that's taking place, not just in terms of our relationship to the somatic realm, our own or the natural realm, but also it was alluded to in part when you were speaking about the pieces that are missing inside the familial unit. There's a fragmentation of lineage, there's a fragmentation of being placed. And that, I think, is really quintessential to the struggles that I'm seeing in men today. This crisis of meaning, high suicidality, a sense of pointlessness or purposelessness. If we don't have a genuine sense of where we are and where we could be that would allow us to both make meaning and receive meaning, live meaningfully, as it were, then we are adrift. We are adrift in essentially a psychic desert, one disconnected from the land, one disconnected from the wisdom that the land brought our ancestors. There's just so much interwoven that when we have even just a couple of cracks in this web, the cascade of negative consequences is devastating. And this is what we're seeing decades later. One thing I wanted to touch on, which I thought was interesting around the archetypal piece and the lack of meaningful ritual or meaningful trajectory of a child into manhood or a child into adulthood. This intersects in some sense with what Mircea Eliade would call the sacred time or sacred space. And we live in a desacralized society. This is what he would say. That is to say, we've taken out the spirit from almost everything, right? The separation of church and state, the emphasis on reductionist, materialist ideology is one way to put it, or worldviews that essentially strip the mystery, strip the very real yet unseen potency of life, of the universe, of the human soul from every aspect. And those who lived in more interwoven and connected ways in the past were sacralized necessarily. They were mythologized. They were mystically participating with their world. And how this relates to archetype is that I really appreciated what you said about how we can sort of perform them. And I think it brought a smile to my face because I honestly find it quite comedic, because it's almost as though if I put on a crown and pick up a sword, somehow I have now entered into what it means to be an actualized man, or to have claimed fully the responsibility of my kingship. But it isn't the case. Like you're saying, there's necessarily a gritty, test rich road that we have to face internally and also within community to understand what it even means to be a king or a warrior or a lover or any of these other archetypes that are necessarily part of our masculine psyche, but are not the only parts of them or the end all be all for understanding what it means to be a man. So definitely a very powerful piece there. Thank you, Soma. And so, what is it then, in terms of your work, that you feel is an antidote to this? Obviously, you alluded to it before, you alluded to aspects of reparenting, and it's obviously not that we have the antidote for all of social problems or society's problems, but what do you do uniquely for men in your work to mitigate for these shortcomings that we've spoken to?
Yeah, I mean, uh, it's definitely multi-layered and somewhat complex, but some of that reparenting work, really begins with where we are, right? So working with what's present in our life, in our psyche, in our body, in our mental, emotional state, and often as we're able to really learn how to get relational to these aspects of ourselves, we, some of the work I do illuminates where we are kind of internally fragmented. And, and, this, I think this is such a key piece, because to me, the work of emotional maturity is really the work of becoming whole, right? Like kind of putting the pieces of ourself back together and pulling those things that we've shut down, cut ourselves off from, out of the dark, out of the closet, and into consciousness. And there's often a lot there, right? Because it's not just our stuff, it's intergenerational. And because we are so oriented towards progress in our lives, it's very easy to just go, right? And leave all that shit behind. And so it's can be a bit tedious, right? Um, and that's counter to what society wants us to be doing. Um, so, part of the work that I do is inviting men to, number one, slow down, um, learn how to be with their bodies, the sensations that are happening, because it's within our bodies that we recognize what we've disconnected from, where we've fragmented, and then we can start to, like I said, get relational, be in conversation with parts of ourselves which often can be conflicting, right? Like one part wants to do this thing, another part wants to do this thing, and because they're all essential to our being. They're here, right? We can't just make them go away. We got to slow down and make space for them. And once we get relational and do that kind of internal work, it starts to create more of a kind of coherence of being, right? So we can carry ourselves forward as more of a kind of congruent experience where we're not, you know, one foot on the gas pedal, the other foot on the brakes. You know, we're actually able to fully move forward in this aligned way with our choices. And I mean, that's just one piece of it, right? So that's like more the internal work. And beyond that, there's the external relational work, which happens, you know, can happen in groups of men, right? Where they can be in a space where they also see aspects of themselves reflected, particularly those aspects where they've, you know, similar parts that have been shamed, denied, suppressed, made wrong. And when one man has the courage to own that, right? To own his own darkness, right? And to own the parts that he has judged and deemed to be inadequate, it becomes an invitation for another man to give himself permission to be who he is, right? And that in itself is, you know, it pulls those parts out of the dark, and then we can start bringing them more forward into the world, right? Like there's not something completely wrong with me. I'm not the only one. These kind of stories that we tell ourselves as men, particularly. Um, and then there's just kind of a ripple effect from that, right? Like when we can bring more of ourselves online, these distortions in our behavior that often cause us to self-sabotage and create dysfunctional relational ways of being and behaviors, they start to iron themselves out, right? Because we're not trying to be something that we're not, you know. That's what happens with the shadow, according to Jungian psychology, right? We suppress, we deny, and then it doesn't go away. It comes out sideways. So, you know, so there's like the internal work, and then as we get more comfortable with ourselves and create a certain new level of self-acceptance, that, you know, that vulnerability becomes easier, right? And it's also a vulnerability that has less of a stigmatized charge around it because we are not shrouding it in our own shame, right? So when we can welcome ourselves in a certain way, we hold ourselves differently, we carry ourselves differently, and the thing that was such a big deal becomes just a part of our humanity. And, you know, that just has such a beautiful ripple effect, not only in our relationships with men, but, you know, intimate partnerships and how we parent and all of
it. Really, I'm feeling the emphasis on that wholeness and that completeness. It's almost as though at present some of the blocks that characterize the path for men into this connection to wholeness is an attachment to what men aren't, or what we can't be if we want to be men. And I think that that's a really powerful thing to recognize. And I'm glad to hear you speak to the Jungian shadow. It made me chuckle, you know, it doesn't go away, it only comes out sideways. There's always going to be, if it's you, put it this way, if what you're repressing is genuinely you, if it's authentic and it's coming forward from your body, then no amount of ignoring it or suppressing it will attend to the need underneath that thing you want to get away from. And so, what I've been toying with, and I feel affirmed in listening to you speak, Soma, on this, is that it's not that there are things that men can't do or can't be, but perhaps it is that there are ways to be those things and do those things that are unique to men. Hopefully that makes sense. It's like we don't need to alienate any aspect of our humanity at the cost of achieving our masculinity. That doesn't work. That equation is not going to function. And so it's about understanding, where does it fit in? Does it fit in insofar as it's something that I believe, but it's false and I can let it go? Is it something that's authentic to me and now I need to weave it lovingly and conscientiously into the tapestry of my own masculinity and my relationships? There's so many different pieces to it. And before we get too deep, we'll take a short break and come back with the second half of the show. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about just how you can help this show grow into the future. Did you know that we have an Instagram, a YouTube, and a Patreon? Probably. But if you're listening on YouTube, like many of you are, I would invite you to subscribe, to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions or maybe guests that you want me to interview. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or any other podcast platform, then please take this moment to rate the show. All of these actions go a long way to helping the Smiling Human podcast reach more people and grow into the future. Thank you so much. Great. Well, we're here with the second half of the show, which means we are into the section called the Question of the Week. This is where I invite our guests to bring forward an inquiry, something that's important to them, something that they might want me to speak on, or that would be interesting for you listeners to hear us discuss. So, Soma, what have you brought for us this week?
Yeah, so my question is about what are the new emerging roles that men of this modern era being called to step into and embody in their lives, in their relationships, and in the world?
A potent question, and one forward-looking. I really appreciate that. One of the first things that comes to mind is to be their brother's keeper. And I think this is not necessarily new, but there is a new way for us to touch on it. So I'll speak to what I mean by that by telling a little story. Yesterday, I was in communication with Matt Sturm, who is going to be on the podcast and is also going to be a part of the No More Heroes Summit. And I was reading one of his articles and going through it bit by bit and agreeing with some pieces and disagreeing with others. I ended up sending in my commentary. But one of the things that I really took away from his work was the absolute necessity of individual accountability and also accountability between men. And so when I say my brother's keeper, it's not just to say, oh, Soma, maybe you don't do that, or da, 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 da. It's not from a punitive or an authoritative point of view, but it's to recognize that if we are to make progress as men in society, in our families, in our current roles, that we need to recognize where, one, we're failing to take full accountability for what's ours, and two, how to recognize when a brother is failing to take accountability, and three, what we can do in that relationship with that brother to support them into fully taking accountability for what's going on. Because I truly believe that it's only when we turn a blind eye to violence or sexism or oppression or, as Matt would put it, a hegemony of masculinity. It's only this way and it only ought to be this way. The very performative piece that you spoke to before. For those of us who are opening into the integrated, into the whole view that takes the yin, the yang, the light, the dark, all of these pieces as genuine and authentic aspects of masculinity, it rests on us to nip that in the bud, because that would be the poison to the progress that our own integration would bring into our communities. And I think that that's a really key one. Mm-hmm. How I see this playing out socially is that we have to bridge the gap between the highly individuated and individualistic mentality of this Western ethos and this community base that we have come from, this tribal base. We don't want to go back to tribalism and nationalism and the rah rah, my group's better than yours. There's a third option that blends the wisdom of the two, that says, I will own all that is mine to own in service to this greater harmony, this greater health of community. So that's the first thing that arose for me from your question. How
Yeah,
does
no,
that land?
I'm really with you on that. I think the hyper individualism that, again, I think is still championed a lot in, even like the modern masculinity movement, is off the mark, for my opinion. And that's the, part of me kind of having an eye on like influencer culture is me doing that, me enacting that like accountability to the culture of masculine leadership. And what are we teaching? What is the framework we're offering? And I'm starting to comment and critique on other teachers that I feel like are kind of missing the mark of that deeper integration, um, which I think is still kind of rooted in this I, me, mine, I'm the champion, even like the king archetype, right? Like, there is a sense of, there's sometimes there are healthy hierarchies that are necessary, but the way it's often presented is not a king like supporting other people to step into their leadership and their strength, and like delegating in a way where it's not, this old school colonialism model, right? Which is where we can be extractive and take the pieces that we want from other people for our own selfish means. So I think that's really important. And I think that is part of the, whether we want to call it patriarchy or, toxic masculinity, those are charged words, but, there is a certain mentality and paradigm that those things are rooted in, and I think necessarily critiqued, whether we want to use that terminology or not. And I think a big piece is we see ourselves as special, right? There's a lack of humility. And I think what's occurred in traditional rites of passage was a deeply humbling experience, right? Where we're put up against the forces of nature that fucking kick our ass to the point where we realize, we're in service to something much greater. And, unless we're coming from that, this like beautiful intersection between like humility, but also finding our power, right? Like a deeper power that's not in a power over orientation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, power with. I,
Mm-hmm.
I heard recently an interesting reorientation of the king archetype, and I think it fits and might serve in part to what you just added, which is, rather than being an archetype as such, we might think of the king as the capacity to properly order and orient our values, so that the king is actually the mechanism that we use to discern value and structure our value hierarchies, that allows us to see what the most important thing is. It's not just the one with the crown and the sword and the chair and I make all the shots, and that enacted piece has us very vulnerable to the foibles of our egoic nature, and thus can lean us towards tyranny, which is, we're seeing it around the world already. It's something that's been a part of geopolitical culture for thousands of years, and frankly, could probably go without it. But when we look at it in terms of a ordering mechanism, then it's exactly like you said. Then when we enter into the king, or when we claim our kingship, what we are saying is, I am active and refined in my capacity to discern value from chaff, and to determine the most valuable out of all of those, such that I can aim towards it. And I think necessarily that the wisdom that comes through maturation leads us in the direction that says that highest piece is not just about I. It can't just be about I. Because if we are, unless we're a sociopath or a psychopath, we see and gain value through relating. And you brought this up in the first half in a very beautiful way, that it's not just about I. It's about how can I be the best I? Yes, and that best I is only really understood in relationship to world, in relationship to woman, in relationship to my children, in relationship to my business and my country and my fellow brothers and sisters. And so that's an interesting piece that I think I wanted to add there, was that
Hmm.
sort of reorientation of King.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and it's tricky to talk about these nuanced things because it's easy to we live in a very black and white world. Like we can be this way but not that way, and a lot of the tone of emotional maturity from my perspective is it's integrative. It's like a both and perspective. It's a capacity to hold duality and paradox and not make one right and the other wrong. And I think that's that's the essence of what it seems like you're getting at, is like, yeah, like sometimes hierarchy is necessary, right? And but there's a relational quality to it. And I just want to speak to like what are some of the other pieces that we're being called into in terms of our role as modern men. And I think that's really key, is that relationality. I think it's we can't ever not be relational, but um, I think the way that masculine conditioning has likely gone for a long time has been less relational, right? Like the relational elements in men are a little less developed than they typically are in women, because of the roles that we've held for however many generations, um, and there are certain capacities and awarenesses that come online the more we can cultivate relationality. And hard to exactly put into words, but like I said, some of the inner work I do cultivates relationship to self. And I think the more we can fine tune this kind of relational sensitivity, which to me the key skill set within that is attunement, right? It's our ability to sense through the whole organism of the body what is needed in a moment, right? That's how our nervous systems are designed to respond to children as parents. We have to intuit how to take care of them. And and I believe that capacity for attunement can carry into every other domain of life, right? We can, in our leadership, if we are in a role of leadership, attune to what is needed in the moment. And that attunement, um, as a high level skill, you know, requires us to not just think about it. We're taught to like solve problems through thinking alone, and there's so many data sets that are available to us that we couldn't process mentally and intellectually alone. So the idea of like being embodied and getting into our bodies and to be able to sense through all all of our capacities, we can process data in a much more efficient way than we would if we like put it on a spreadsheet, tried to figure it all out that way. And because life is becoming increasingly more complex as we evolve and all these new technologies are coming online, I really believe the people that are developing this, maybe it's a kind of a sixth sense, but it's an ability to tap into all the information that's happening all at once in a given moment, and to make a wise decision from that to be of service to what's needed. for the
Mm.
greater whole, the greater good.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. The key pieces: attunement, sensitivity, relatedness, and emotional maturity, I think are so interwoven in a really beautiful way, particularly as it relates to the masculine's conception, and I say that as a mental conception and impression of the feminine. And when we are talking about sensitivity or a willingness to feel, so much of our human nature as it pertains to relating is feeling based. It's not mental. Yes, you and I are having a conversation and I have to be relatively coherent in my thoughts and be in my mind to a degree, but I'm now allowing myself as well to feel your words. And I think that is what really characterizes, from my perspective, the difference between an emotionally immature and emotionally mature. It's the willingness to feel. We have to be willing to confront, and not in an aggressive way, but to turn towards, turn our attention, turn our bodies, turn our focus towards the reality of what it means to be human in a given moment. And that's not just mind, but it's all of our senses. It is the intuition, it's the feeling sensation, it's all of it. And that we might rewrite collectively, and I think it's already taking place, the idea that when we are sensitive or sensitized, that somehow that is degrading to our masculinity, when in fact it's quite the opposite. The courage to feel is an immensely powerful expression of masculinity. Am I willing to confront the pain here? Am I willing to confront the fear? Am I willing to confront the lies in my own brain or in the environment around me? It's almost as though we need to extricate or to detangle the idea of sensitivity and fragility. Because I think
Mm-hmm.
these are very, very different, right?
Yeah.
That which is fragile because it is rigid, it is unwilling and unmoving. But that which is sensitive, those are the hunters, those are the shamans, those are the kings, like you're saying, who are attuned not only to the needs of the court, but the needs of all in his domain. There is such a distinct difference that I think is not adequately understood in the common man, in my opinion.
Yeah, 100%. I'm really glad you made that distinction, because it's something that I hold to be very true too, between like fragility and sensitivity. Yeah, sensitivity to me is an absolute strength, and it's a capacity, right? Like your capacity to feel deeply shows you're a strong dude, that you can hold a lot. And yeah, so I think that the way we often use that term is kind of misappropriated, when, to me, sensitivity really equates to somebody's ability to really be with more, like I can handle more, like my nervous system is strong to be able to be with all that's going on. And yeah, we need that for sure.
Definitely. I
Yeah.
started parsing these apart when I was confronted with this conversation inside of a relationship. I thought, there's such a sour taste with sensitivity. And my second language is French. I also speak Spanish, but in French, sensible, it's spelled sensible, means sensitive. And if we were to say, oh, you're such a sensible man, no one's going to take that as a, an
Right.
affront to their masculinity.
Yeah.
There's room when we look at those two words, sensitivity and sensible. And it's like, okay, if I'm sensible, that means I am able to sense. I'm
Hmm.
sense willing. I'm sense curious. And again, that brings me back to the almost the alchemical aspect of Jung, which he says, nothing human is alien to me. And that's a really key piece I think that we're talking to here, is that when we are looking to make any sort of progress on the path of maturation, be it emotional, psychological, physical, whatever it is, that willingness to step forward almost in faith, and that can have an interesting charge to it with some people too. But we're stepping into the unknown. We're stepping into that potentiality, which is hearkened to the feminine as well. And we're doing so with no guarantee of survival. But we're doing it because we understand that that ossification, that rigidity, the antiquated logos, and I'll bring that word in here because you were talking about relatedness. Eros is understood to be the aspect of the feminine creative principle, and logos that of the masculine creative principle. But logos can get really rigid. And when we are too much in that rigidity, that's when the fragility comes in. We lose the ability to adapt. It's like I picked up an oak quarterstaff from my brother today for one of the workshops that I'm doing. And I'm intending on using it as a demonstration similar to a biblical story where Moses and Aaron confront the Pharaoh in Egypt. And what Aaron does, Moses or Aaron, forgive me to the Christians who are listening, I haven't got it exactly right, and my Jewish friends, they cast the staff down in front of the Pharaoh and it turns into a serpent. And the idea that we can take something that is straight and turn it into something that is fluctuating, undulating, moving, and that we can bring it back from that, I think that is where the balance in wise and matured emotionality inside of the masculine mindset is. And I'll sum it up as this. Our capacity to feel and hold sensation, be it emotional or otherwise, only grows when we're willing to allow those rigid aspects of self or belief to become like snakes, to become moldable and mutable, and then to do the work to bring them back. We allow ourselves to fall apart, into decay, into death, and we do so willingly, like the hero on his journey into the dragon's den, and then come back with a greater structure, informed by the journey into that mutability.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. And I'm imagining like the wood of an oak. It's a really hard wood, and I love observing like the patterns in nature, right? And when you see oak, like where there's kind of a burl or a knot, or a place where a branch broke and healed, it creates all these really beautiful undulating patterns, right? And it's actually the densest part of the wood, right? It's the strongest part. And I think that's, really key in there is like when we allow ourselves to really break down and dissolve the, identities, these kind of rigid identities of what we fixate on as like what it means to be a man or who I think that I am. When we can dissolve that, we allow ourselves to really, heal back up into a stronger version of ourselves. And I think so many men are afraid to confront who they think they are, right? They've kind of formed such a very rigid construct of self or masculinity that, like you said, makes them actually more fragile. They have these kind of external crusts of strength, but it's just a crust. And beautiful exploration there. But I love the kind of metaphors that are built into it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I think we can. I'd add one more thing before we tie our threads for this conversation, which is that fear of who they could be. It's funny because we often conceptualize or hear the shadow conceptualized as the place where we disown and exile all the parts we don't like about ourselves. When in actuality, it's not just the nasty, shameful pieces, but it's also our greatness. A lot of people are afraid of how great they actually could be and exile those talents, exile that capacity to be a deep feeling, a deep thinker, a deep achiever, whatever it is, into the same place of weakness or fragility or what have you. So I just wanted to add that for the people listening, that when we're talking about opening into the shadow, you're not just going to find bugs and dirt and decay. You might actually find a beautiful golden egg of what is actually yours. So on that note, Soma, for the people who are listening and they're curious to connect with you more deeply and have resonated with what you've offered today, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I'm mostly active on Instagram in terms of social media. I'm on Facebook a little bit too. Sometimes I my longer form writing that I actually enjoy a bit more. I'll post on Facebook because it's not as conducive to Instagram. But yeah, if you can check out my Instagram handle, which is at the.essential.man. If you want to check out my website and some of the work I do, it is theessentialman.net. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And as always, those links will be in the description. Soma, it was a sincere pleasure to converse with you again. I look forward to more conversations in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much for the invitation, Oak.
And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have 2 invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind-the-scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you could like, share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.